I have been living in the UK for almost 2 years now, and I just need to get this off my chest. When I first packed up my life in the States and moved across the pond, I thought, okay, they speak English, they watch the same Netflix shows, how different can it really be? I was literally shocked because there is this massive illusion that the US and Europe are totally culturally parallel just because we share Western history and pop culture. But the truth is, living here as an American expat has completely broken my brain. It has ripped the veil off my eyes about things I accepted as completely normal my entire life in America, which I now realize are, frankly, insane. We need to talk about this because once you see these things from an outside perspective, you cannot unsee them. Let us start with something so basic, so incredibly mundane, that you probably have never even questioned it. Public bathrooms, specifically the gap in the bathroom stalls. In the US, we would never think twice about the fact that when you go into a public restroom, there is a solid 1 inch gap between the door and the frame. You are sitting there completely vulnerable, and anyone walking by can just accidentally lock eyes with you. It is horrifying, but in America, it is just life. When I first used a public restroom in the UK, I walked in and closed the door, and it was a solid floor-to-ceiling door. It felt like I was stepping into a panic room. There were no gaps. Nobody could see my shoes. I had actual absolute privacy, and it made me wonder, why on earth do American bathrooms look like poorly constructed saloon doors? I did a deep dive into this, and the history is wild. The American bathroom stall design basically comes down to hyper-capitalist cost-cutting and a very weird puritanical obsession with surveillance. Back in the early 20th century, as mass commercial buildings were booming in the US, architects and developers realized that building actual individual rooms for toilets was too expensive and took up too much space. Frank Lloyd Wright actually popularized the idea of partition systems in commercial bathrooms to save money. By mass-producing standardized metal partitions that hovered a foot off the ground with gaps in the doors, companies saved millions on materials and installation. The gap means the doors do not have to be perfectly fitted. It is incredibly cheap, but there is a psychological element too. In the US, there has always been this underlying cultural paranoia about what people are doing in public restrooms. The gaps, the high floors, the low ceilings, they were intentionally designed so that security or management could easily see if someone was doing drugs, having a medical emergency, or doing anything illicit. It is built on a lack of trust. In Europe, the prevailing psychology is completely different. Privacy is viewed as a fundamental human right, not a luxury. They would find it barbaric to expect someone to handle their most private bodily functions while making accidental eye contact with a stranger washing their hands. One more thing, guys, if you want more than the public version of these videos, join the membership below. You'll get the deeper stories, the extra context, and the more unfiltered version of me that doesn't always make it into the main uploads. And speaking of a lack of trust and the American obsession with productivity, we absolutely have to talk about work-life balance and paid time off. This is a topic that makes me so emotional because it is destroying us and we do not even realize it. In the US, the hustle culture is practically a religion. I remember being at my old job in Chicago and my coworker literally answered an email from her hospital bed after having her appendix removed. And what did we do? We praised her for her dedication. We thought she was a rock star. In Europe, if you did that, your boss would be horrified and HR would probably lock you out of your email account. Here is the truth. The United States is the only advanced economy in the entire world that does not guarantee a single day of paid vacation by federal law. Zero. It is entirely up to your employer. If you are lucky, you get 2 weeks. In the UK, the legal minimum is 28 days of paid leave per year. Let me repeat that, 28 days, and they actually take it. When a European puts on their out-of-office autoresponder, they mean it. It usually says something like, I am on holiday until September. If this is an emergency, please contact literally anyone else. Why is the US so unhinged about this? It traces all the way back to the Puritan work ethic. When the early colonists came to America, they brought this extreme Calvinist ideology where hard work and constant toil were seen as literal signs of religious salvation. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. Max Weber wrote a whole book about this, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. We inherently tied our moral worth to our labor output. Fast forward to the 20th century, during the Great Depression, the US passed the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 to protect workers. It gave us the minimum wage and the 40-hour work week, But business lobbying was so intense that they completely dropped the provision for paid vacation. They argued it would destroy American business. Meanwhile, over in Europe, especially post-Miners World War II, the social democratic movements rebuilt their societies with the explicit belief that leisure time is essential for human dignity. The European Union eventually passed the Working Time Directive, which legally caps the work week and mandates paid rest. Americans have this misconception that Europeans are lazy because of this. We are taught to look down on the French for going on strike or the Spanish for the siesta, but the reality is they are living longer, they report higher levels of happiness, and their economies are still highly competitive. They just work to live, while Americans live to work. Now, let us entirely switch gears and talk about the actual physical layout of our lives, because I need to talk about jaywalking. Living in the UK, I walk everywhere. London is a massively walkable city, but even in smaller towns, pedestrians have rights. If I want to cross the street here and there are no cars coming, I just cross the street. Nobody yells at me, nobody gives me a ticket. When I go back to the US, I feel like a criminal just for trying to cross a 4-lane road to get to a Target. In America, we treat walking as an extreme sport or a sign of poverty. If you are walking, people assume your car broke down, and if you cross outside of a painted crosswalk, you are committing a crime called jaywalking. But jaywalking is a fake crime. I was literally shocked when I learnt the history of this. In the 1910s and 20s, before cars completely took over, American streets were chaotic, but they belonged to the people. Kids played in the streets, vendors sold food, and pedestrians crossed wherever they wanted. But as cars became more popular, they started hitting and killing people at an alarming rate, especially children. The public was outraged. They hated cars. They wanted to mandate speed limiters on engines to keep them under 25 miles per hour. The automobile industry, the manufacturers and the motor clubs panicked. They realized that if the public won, the car industry would die. So they engaged in one of the most successful psychological PR campaigns in human history. They decided they had to shift the blame from the driver of the multi-ton metal death machine to the person walking. They coined the term jaywalker. Back then, a jay was a slang term for a country bumpkin, an idiot from the sticks who didn't know how to navigate a sophisticated city. They started running public shaming campaigns. They hired Boy Scouts to hand out cards to pedestrians, telling them they were stupid jays. They got local governments to pass ordinances legally confining pedestrians to crosswalks, effectively handing over 90% of the public space to private vehicles. Today, we just accept it. We build massive, sprawling cities where you absolutely need a car to survive, and we blame pedestrians if they get hit. In Europe, the cities are obviously much older. They were built for horses and humans centuries before the internal combustion engine was even a thought. But even after World War II, when Europe was rebuilding, places like the Netherlands actively fought back against car supremacy. In the 1970s, the Dutch had a massive protest movement called Stop the Child Murder, demanding safe streets, and they won. Their government redesigned the infrastructure to prioritize human beings. Americans always say, well, America is too big to be walkable. And sure, crossing the entire country requires a car or a plane, but 80% of Americans live in urban areas. Our towns could be walkable, but it is illegal to build them that way because of zoning laws. We have essentially outlawed the traditional human-scale neighborhood. Speaking of things we are just blindly accepting, we desperately need to talk about the food. And I am not just talking about the fact that the food here in the UK tastes fresher, I am talking about the fact that American food is legally poisoning us. When I first moved here, I bought a regular loaf of sliced bread from the grocery store. I made a sandwich, took a bite, and I had to stop, because it just tasted like bread. It tasted savory. American bread, by comparison, tastes like cake. It is so sweet, and it is not just the bread, it is everything. I remember bringing my favorite American snacks back from a trip home, comparing the ingredients to the exact same brand sold in the UK, and my jaw dropped. In America, the ingredient list was a paragraph of chemical names. In the UK, it was like 5 real ingredients. Why is this happening? You have to look at the history of the FDA and the agricultural lobbying in America. Let us talk about high fructose corn syrup. In the 1970s, the US was dealing with massive inflation and food prices were soaring. Richard Nixon appointed a man named Earl Butz as the Secretary of Agriculture. His entire philosophy was get big or get out. He pushed farmers to plant commodities, Massive, endless fields of corn and soy, from fence row to fence row. The government subsidized this corn so heavily that we suddenly had a mountain of cheap corn and nothing to do with it. Enter food scientists. They figured out how to turn this incredibly cheap, subsidized corn into high fructose corn syrup. Suddenly, it was cheaper to use this synthetic syrup than real sugar, so American food companies pumped it into literally everything. Bread, pasta sauce, salad dressing, crackers. Our entire palate was hijacked to expect a baseline level of intense sweetness in savory foods, but it goes deeper than just sugar. It is about how our legal systems view risk. In Europe, they operate on the precautionary principle. This basically means that if a new food additive or chemical is invented, the manufacturer has to definitively prove that it is safe for human consumption before they are allowed to put it in our food. In America, the FDA operates on a reactive model. We have something called the GRAS list, which stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. Thanks to massive corporate lobbying, food and chemical companies in the US are actually allowed to self-declare that a new ingredient is safe, put it in the food supply, and the FDA will not step in unless a ton of people get visibly sick and the scientific consensus proves it is dangerous years later. We are the guinea pigs. Take food dyes, for example. Red dye 40, yellow 5, yellow 6. These are petroleum-based synthetic dyes. In Europe, because studies have linked these dyes to hyperactivity in children and potential neurobehavioral issues, foods containing them have to carry a massive warning label. Because of that warning label, European companies just reformulated their products using natural coloring from beets or turmeric. But in America, the FDA says the evidence isn't strong enough to ban it, so American kids are eating neon-colored cereals and snacks loaded with petroleum byproducts. Potassium bromate, which is an oxidizer used to make bread dough more elastic, is a known possible human carcinogen. It is banned in the UK, the European Union, Canada, China, and Brazil. But you can still find it in American baked goods. In the US, we prioritize the profit margins and shelf life requirements of multinational corporations over the long-term metabolic health of our citizens. Okay, since we are talking about going out to eat, I have to talk about the most stressful part of American culture, which I do not miss at all. Tipping. The tipping culture in America has completely spiraled out of control. In the US, you buy a drip coffee, the barista spins an iPad around, and it stares at you, demanding 20, 25, or 30%. You feel this intense wave of guilt. If you hit no tip, you feel like a villain. In the UK, tipping is just a nice little bonus if you had a brilliant sit-down meal. 10% is standard, 12.5% is usually added as an optional service charge in London, but there is absolutely zero pressure. You tap your card and you leave. Also, very quickly I checked the analytics, and apparently around 87% of you are watching without subscribing, which is kind of wild because if you're still here listening to me unravel over, you are very much the target audience. So subscribe now because I've got a lot more of this coming. Americans defend our tipping culture to the death. We say, well, it ensures good service. If waiters are not working for tips, they will be rude and ignore you. This is completely false. The service in Europe is fine. They just don't fake smile and interrupt your conversation every 5 minutes to ask how the first bite is tasting. But the real issue is the dark, incredibly messed up history of why we tip in America. Tipping actually originated in aristocratic Europe as a noble custom, where lords would give extra coins to servants to ensure promptitude. That is where the acronym TIPPY comes from, to ensure promptitude. But early Americans hated it. In the 1800s, Americans thought tipping was deeply undemocratic. It created a master-servant dynamic that went against the ideals of a classless republic. So how did it become the American standard? We have to go back to the post-Civil War era. After slavery was abolished, millions of formerly enslaved Black Americans were looking for work. The Pullman Company, which ran luxury sleeper trains, hired thousands of Black men to work as porters. But George Pullman, the founder, refused to pay them a decent base wage. Instead, he forced them to rely entirely on the tips of the wealthy white passengers. It was a loophole to keep labor virtually free and maintain a racial hierarchy. The restaurant and hospitality industries saw this and copied the model. They realized they could legally shift the burden of paying their employees directly onto the customer. When the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938, establishing a minimum wage, the restaurant lobby fought tooth and nail to exclude tipped workers. To this day, the federal tipped minimum wage in the United States is $2.13 an hour. It has not gone up since 1991. The entire American service industry is built on subsidizing corporate payrolls through the emotional manipulation of the customer. In Europe, being a waiter or a bartender is a respected profession. They are paid a living wage, they get their 28 days of paid vacation, they get health care, and they do not have to endure harassment or abuse from customers just to make sure they can pay their rent that month. And speaking of paying, let us talk about the absolute mental gymnastics required to buy anything in an American store. The price tag. In the UK, if I walk into a shop and I see a candle that says £10, I walk up to the register, I hand them £10, and I walk out. The tax is already included in the price. It is called value-added tax, or VAT, and the law requires absolute transparency. When I am back in the States and I go to buy a coffee that says it costs $4, I hand the cashier $4 and they look at me like I am an idiot because the total is actually $4.37. Why do we do this? Why do Americans tolerate the psychological torture of never knowing exactly how much something costs until the register? The common counter-argument you always hear from Americans is, well, America is too big. We have different taxes in every state, so national brands can't print the taxes on the packaging. And yes, because of the 10th Amendment and our extreme devotion to state rights, we have over 13,000 different sales tax jurisdictions in the US. The state has a tax, the county has a tax, the city has a tax, sometimes even a specific transit district has a tax. But that excuse completely falls apart when you realize we now have digital price tags and localized printing. A store in Dallas knows exactly what the tax is in Dallas. They could easily print the final price on the shelf tag. The real reason they don't is psychological pricing. American retailers want the sticker price to look as low as humanly possible to get you to commit to the purchase. They know that if you see a blender for $99, your brain registers it as cheaper than if it said $107 with tax. By the time you get to the register and the tax is added, the psychological friction of backing out of the transaction is too high, so you just pay it. It is entirely designed to manipulate consumer behavior and maximize spending. In Europe, consumer protection laws dictate that the consumer has the right to know the exact final cost of a good before making a purchasing decision. It is treated as a matter of honesty. In America, the right of the corporation to market a lower base price completely supersedes the right of the consumer to have transparent pricing. Finally, I saved the most dystopian, mind-blowing difference for last. We need to talk about prescription drug commercials. If you live in America, you don't even notice them anymore. You are sitting on the couch watching a football game or a sitcom, and suddenly a commercial comes on. It shows a middle-aged woman in a flowing white cardigan walking a golden retriever on a beautiful beach. Soft acoustic guitar music is playing, and the cheerful voiceover says, "Ask your doctor about a Zempi something or Looney something." And then, while the woman is laughing with her handsome husband at a farmer's market, a speed reader voice lists off a terrifying string of side effects. May cause internal bleeding, liver failure, spontaneous combustion, and death. Do not take this medication if you are allergic to it. And the commercial ends with, "Ask your doctor if this pill is right for you." When I try to explain these commercials to my British friends, they look at me like I am describing a science fiction horror movie. Direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising is illegal in almost every single country on Earth. There are exactly 2 countries where it is legal, New Zealand and the United States. In the UK and all of Europe, the idea that a pharmaceutical company would directly market a highly restricted, potentially dangerous chemical compound to an uneducated consumer is viewed as deeply unethical. How did this become normal in America? It really ramped up in 1997. The FDA released new guidelines that essentially deregulated broadcast advertising for prescription drugs. Before 1997, if a drug company wanted to run an ad, they had to include a massive detailed brief of all the risks, which was too expensive and boring for a 30-second TV spot. But the FDA changed the rules to say that companies only had to list the major risks and direct consumers to a magazine or a website for more info. It opened the floodgates. Big Pharma started pouring billions of dollars into television advertising, but it is the psychology behind this that is truly insane. In America, our healthcare system is fundamentally a free market enterprise. Therefore, patients are not treated as patients, we are treated as consumers. The pharmaceutical companies know that if they run an emotional ad featuring a golden retriever, you will go to your doctor and specifically demand that brand name drug. And American doctors, who are often stressed, overworked, and operating in a system of defensive medicine where they fear malpractice lawsuits, will often just write the prescription to keep the customer happy. It completely flips the medical hierarchy. The consumer, who has absolutely zero medical training, is dictating their treatment plan based on a marketing campaign designed by a PR firm in New York. In the UK, under the National Health Service, healthcare is a collective social safety net. Doctors prescribe medication based strictly on clinical guidelines and the efficacy of generic drugs. If you have a specific ailment, the doctor diagnoses you and tells you what the standard, scientifically backed treatment is. There is no brand loyalty because nobody is watching TV ads for blood pressure medication. The system is designed to treat the illness as efficiently as possible, not to maximize the quarterly profits of a pharmaceutical conglomerate. Americans will counter this by saying, well, our system drives innovation. We fund the medical research for the rest of the world. And while it is true that a lot of pharmaceutical research happens in the US, taxpayers heavily subsidize that research through government grants, only for the private companies to patent the drugs and sell them back to us at a 10,000% markup. We are being exploited under the guise of freedom of choice. Living in the UK for the past couple of years has been the greatest education of my life. It is not that Europe is a perfect utopia. Believe me, they have their own massive problems, their own bureaucratic nightmares, and I miss American convenience and Mexican food every single day. But stepping outside the American bubble has shown me that so many of the things we stress about, the things we just accept as the unavoidable struggles of life, are actually conscious policy choices. The lack of privacy, the toxic work culture, the hostile architecture, the chemically altered food, the manipulative pricing, the predatory tipping, and the corporatization of our health. None of this is a law of nature. It was all designed this way, and once you realize that, you realize it could also be designed differently.